In the vast expanse of space, where countless civilizations rose and fell, humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council wasn't exactly what we hoped for. The council chambers, with their towering crystal walls and floating platforms, felt more like a courtroom than a diplomatic meeting. I remember standing there as Earth's military representative, watching those alien faces twist into what I could only guess was amusement. The council's chief speaker, a tall being with iridescent scales and multiple eyes, leaned forward from their elevated position. Their translator device crackled to life, converting their melodic language into English. So your species still relies on projectile weapons? How quaint. The chamber filled with various sounds, clicks, whistles, and hums that our translation software identified as laughter. I shifted uncomfortably in my dress uniform, my hand instinctively reaching for the ceremonial sidearm at my hip, a gesture that only seemed to amuse them further. Next to me, Captain Sarah Chen remained perfectly still, her face a mask of professional calm despite the mockery. We'd spent months preparing for this meeting, hoping to secure Earth's place among the stars. Instead, we were being treated like children who'd walked into a room full of adults, proudly showing off our crayon drawings. With all due respect, Sarah spoke up, her voice steady and clear. Our weapons may seem primitive to you, but they've served us well. A ripple of what seemed like patronizing chatter spread through the chamber. The various alien representatives, some floating, others perched on gravity-defying seats, exchanged knowing looks with their multiple sets of eyes. The chief speaker raised a scaled appendage, silencing the chamber. Your species has barely mastered basic space travel. Your weapons use explosive chemical reactions to propel metal projectiles. The civilizations here have moved beyond such prehistoric methods. We use gravitic lances, plasma arrays, quantum disruptors. Perhaps in a few centuries, you'll be ready to join us properly. That's when things got interesting. A low rumble shook the chamber, and emergency lights began pulsing in colors I'd never seen before. The council's security feeds lit up, showing a massive ship dropping out of faster-than-light travel. A Drachnid war vessel, the same species that had been raiding the council's outer colonies for months. Impossible, the chief speaker declared. They couldn't have breached our defensive grid, but they had, and suddenly, our primitive weapons didn't seem so amusing anymore. As the council chambers descended into chaos, I caught Sarah. The chief speaker's translucent scales shifted from their usual pearlescent sheen to a deep blue, a change I'd later learn indicated extreme distress. You knew the Drachnids were coming, they stated, not a question but an accusation. The chamber's atmospheric processors hummed louder, struggling to keep up with the increased respiratory rates of dozens of panicked council members. Not exactly, I replied, keeping my voice level, but we've been tracking their raid patterns for the past 6 months. It wasn't hard to predict they'd eventually aim for the biggest target, you. Sarah stepped forward, pulling up a holographic display from her wrist device. The three-dimensional map showed the Drachnids' previous attack routes, all converging toward the council's location like streams flowing into a river. The council's security director, a being composed mostly of shifting crystalline structures, chimed in with a sound like breaking glass. Your weapons, they're so simple. How could they possibly? They trailed off, their structure flickering with what I assumed was uncertainty. Before I could respond, the station shook again. The Drachnid ship had opened fire, their energy weapons splashing harmlessly against the council's shields. But unlike our previous encounters with alien technology, we'd come prepared. Captain Chen activated her comm link, her words crisp and professional. All ships, initiate Operation Slingshot. Standard scatter pattern, just like we practiced. Through the chamber's massive viewport, I watched our fleet move with precision that would have made any drill sergeant proud. The ships, deliberately designed to look outdated and clunky by council standards, split into predetermined formations. What the aliens saw as primitive was actually carefully crafted deception. Those outdated hulls housed targeting systems that had been refined through centuries of warfare, guided by AI systems that could calculate trajectories faster than any organic brain. Your shields are impressive, I explained to the increasingly attentive council, and your energy weapons are beyond anything we've developed. But sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones. Newton's laws of motion don't care about energy shields. The first salvo from our rail guns cut through space like shooting stars. Simple tungsten rods, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, carried more kinetic energy than a nuclear blast. The Drachnid's shields, designed to deflect energy weapons and gravitic forces, might as well have been tissue paper. The council members watched in stunned silence as the first impacts struck the Drachnid vessel. No explosions, no dramatic energy discharges, just precise, devastating holes punched clean through their hull. Their mighty ship, which had terrorized the council for months, was being systematically dismantled by what they'd dismissed as primitive weapons. Fascinating, the chief speaker whispered, their scales slowly shifting to a color I hadn't seen before. All this time, we assumed technological advancement meant complexity. We never considered. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. On Earth, we have a saying, keep it simple, stupid. Sometimes the most effective solution isn't the most sophisticated one. But our moment of triumph was short-lived. The station's sensors detected multiple new signatures emerging from FTL travel. The Drachnids, it seemed, hadn't come alone. As more of their ships appeared, I could see the council members' confidence wavering again. They'd seen what our weapons could do against one ship, but against a fleet. I caught Sarah's eye, and she nodded slightly. We had more tricks up our sleeves, but revealing them would mean showing just how much humanity had been holding back. The real question was, how much should we show, and how much should we keep in reserve? The Drachnid fleet spread out in a classic pincer formation, their sleek ships gleaming under the light of distant stars. I counted 12 vessels, each larger than the first one we'd engaged. The council chamber had gone deadly quiet, save for the soft hum of emergency systems and the occasional whisper of fear from the assembled representatives. Sarah's hand brushed against my sleeve, our prearranged signal. "Lieutenant Adams," she said softly, using my title for the first time since we'd arrived. "I believe it's time for Phase 2. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the surge of anticipation. The council members watched our exchange with their various sensory organs, clearly trying to decipher what we were planning. "Chief Speaker," I addressed the scaled being directly, "what you're about to see doesn't leave this chamber. Consider it a gesture of trust." I pulled out what looked like an ordinary tablet, its screen displaying what appeared to be basic tactical information. The council's security director leaned forward, their crystalline structure reflecting light in complex patterns. 8 minutes ago, I continued, when the first Drachnid ship appeared, we activated our secondary defense network. My fingers danced across the tablet's surface, and new symbols appeared on the main tactical display. Hundreds of them scattered throughout the surrounding space, previously invisible to both Council and Drachnid sensors. The chief speaker's scales rippled with confusion. "What are we looking at?" they asked, all their eyes fixed on the display. "We call them fireflies," Sarah explained, her voice carrying a hint of pride. "Microsatellites, each about the size of my fist. We've been seeding them throughout Council space for the past 3 months, disguised as routine merchant shipments." She paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "Each one carries a scaled-down version of our railgun technology." The Drachnid fleet was moving closer, their formation tightening as they prepared for what they thought would be an easy victory. They had no idea they were flying into a carefully prepared kill zone. The Council's security director made a sound like chiming bells, their species equivalent of a ghast. I'd learn later. "You've been preparing for this," they said, their crystalline form vibrating with realization. "All those diplomatic missions, the trade routes." I nodded. "We knew the Drachnids would eventually strike here. You weren't the only ones tracking their patterns." The tactical display updated, showing the enemy fleet now fully encompassed by our hidden network. "But there's something else you should know about human warfare. We don't just plan for the battle. We plan for what comes after." Sarah activated her comm again, this time switching to a different channel. "All ships, initiate Firefleet Protocol Omega. Authorization, Chen 7 Delta 9. The response came back immediately, a chorus of acknowledgments from our fleet commanders. The tension in the chamber was palpable as everyone watched the tactical display. The Drachnid fleet had stopped advancing, perhaps finally sensing that something wasn't right. Their ships began to shift formation, energy readings suggesting they were powering up their weapons. That's when I saw it, the slight tremor in Sarah's hand as she held her tablet. Only those who knew her well would notice it, but I did, because what we were about to do wasn't just about defending the Council or proving humanity's worth. It was about revealing just how far we'd come, and how much we'd hidden from the galaxy at large. The chief speaker must have noticed something in our demeanor. "There's more, isn't there?" they asked, their scales now shifting through colors I'd never seen before. "What aren't you telling us?" Before I could answer, the tactical display lit up with new warnings. The Drachnids had launched their first salvo, not at us, but at the Council station itself. In the next few seconds, everything would change. The only question was, would the galaxy be ready for what humanity was about to unveil? Emergency protocols engaged. The Council station's AI announced as the Drachnid weapons fire approached. The chief speaker's scales had turned almost white with fear. They knew their shields, while impressive, weren't designed to handle this level of concentrated fire. But I allowed myself a small smile, because they'd played right into our hands. "Now," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the approaching danger. The space between the Drachnid fleet and the Council station suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. Thousands of fireflies activated simultaneously, their tiny forms barely visible but their effect unmistakable. The incoming energy weapons fire simply vanished. The Council chamber erupted in surprised exclamations. The security director's crystalline form was vibrating so rapidly they were almost blur. "Impossible. You've developed energy absorption technology, but our sensors never detected." "Not absorption," I corrected, unable to keep a hint of pride from my voice. "Redirection." On the tactical display, we could see the Drachnid's own weapon fire emerging from the Firefleet network at different points, striking their ship's shields from multiple angles. But that wasn't the real surprise. Suddenly, new signatures appeared on the tactical display, massive ones, emerging from what appeared to be empty space. The Council members rushed to the viewport, their various appendages pressed against the transparent material in disbelief. There, shimmering into visibility, were three ships that dwarfed everything else in the battlefield. Their design was unmistakably human, but unlike anything we'd shown the galaxy before. "May I present the Earth Defense Force's first Titan-class vessels," Sarah announced, her tablet displaying the ship's specs. "What you've seen until now was our civilian fleet. This is our real Navy." The chief speaker's scales had shifted to a color I'd never seen before, almost metallic. "You've been hiding these all this time." Their voice carried both accusation and awe. But before I could respond, one of the Council's junior members, a species that communicated through bioluminescence, flashed an urgent pattern. The tactical display updated, showing new signatures emerging from FTL. But these weren't Drachnid ships. They were different, ancient, and terrifyingly familiar to everyone in the chamber. "The precursors," the security director whispered, their crystalline form dimming with fear. "They were supposed to be extinct." Sarah and I exchanged glances. This wasn't part of our plan. The precursors were supposed to be long gone, a civilization that had vanished millennia ago, leaving only ruins and mysteries behind. Yet here they were, their massive ships making our Titans look like toys in comparison. "Tell me," the chief speaker's voice had taken on a new urgency, "did your species plan for this too?" I looked at the tactical display, watching as both the Drachnid fleet and our own forces paused. All attention turned to the new arrivals. The precursor ships were arranging themselves in a pattern I didn't recognize, their ancient technology making our sensors struggle to get clear readings. "No," I admitted, "but we did plan for something like it." I pulled up a secure channel on my tablet, entering a code that I'd hoped never to use. "Sarah, remember that project under the Atlantic? The one even the Council doesn't know about." She nodded, her eyes widening slightly. "You don't mean—" "Yeah," I said, entering the final authorization code. It's time to show them why humans don't just plan for victory. We plan for survival. The council chamber fell silent as my tablet displayed a countdown. Whatever happened next would reshape the galaxy's understanding of humanity forever. The only question was, would it be enough to face what was coming? The precursor ships hung in space like ancient monoliths, their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift and change as we watched. My tablet's countdown reached 0, and for a moment, nothing happened. The council chamber was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of environmental systems. Then the ocean back on Earth began to move, not just ripple or wave. The entire Atlantic Ocean started to part, revealing what humanity had hidden beneath its waters for the past decade. The Council's long-range sensors lit up with readings they couldn't begin to comprehend. On the tactical display, we could see it rising, a structure larger than any city, built from technology that merged human ingenuity with something far older. What you're seeing, Sarah explained to the stunned Council, is Project Atlantis. 10 years ago, we found something in the deepest part of our ocean, a precursor seed ship. But unlike every other civilization that discovered their artifacts, we didn't just study it. We learned to communicate with it. The chief speaker's scales had turned completely transparent, a sign of absolute shock. I'd later learn. You merged your technology with theirs. Better, I said, watching as Project Atlantis fully emerged from Earth's waters. We learned why they disappeared. They didn't go extinct, they evolved, and they left behind tools for other species to follow, if they were ready. The precursor ships had stopped their advance, their formation changing into something that looked almost like recognition. That's when Project Atlantis activated its main system, sending out a signal that made every piece of technology in the sector fluctuate for a moment. The Drachnid fleet, caught between our forces and the precursor ships, attempted to retreat, but they'd waited too long. The signal from Atlantis reached their ships, and suddenly their supposedly impenetrable shields flickered and died. Our Fireflies and Titans opened fire simultaneously, their rail guns turning the mighty Drachnid vessels into Swiss cheese. But the real show was just beginning. The precursor ships responded to Atlantis' signal with one of their own, not a weapon or a threat, but a key that humanity had spent a decade learning how to use. The precursors didn't leave because they were dying, Sarah explained, her voice filled with wonder despite having known this secret for years. They left to give younger species a chance to prove themselves worthy of joining them. Each artifact they left behind was a test, monitoring how civilizations would use their discoveries. The chief speaker's scales had begun to shift through colors rapidly, and humanity passed. I shook my head. No, we did something they never expected. Instead of using their technology to dominate, we figured out how to integrate it with our own. Those primitive rail guns, they're based on precursor kinetic principles, just scaled down and simplified. We proved we could advance without losing what made us human. The precursor ships were moving again, but this time they were forming a circle around both the Council station and our fleet. Energy patterns we'd never seen before began to flow between their vessels, creating what looked like a gateway in space itself. They're not here to destroy us, Sarah said softly. They're here to invite us, all of us, to see what's beyond our galaxy. But first, they wanted to make sure we could work together. She looked pointedly at the Council members. That's why we let you underestimate us. We needed to prove that humanity could protect without conquering. The chief speaker stepped forward, their scales finally settling into a deep gold color. You knew, all this time, you knew what was coming, and you prepared not just your species, but all of us. I nodded, watching as the gateway stabilized, showing us glimpses of things that defied description. That's the thing about humans. We don't just plan for the fight, we plan for the peace that follows. Now, I gestured to the gateway, who's ready to see what's really out there. The council chamber erupted in excited chatter as representatives from dozens of species realized what this meant. But I noticed the chief speaker studying me carefully. One last question, they said quietly. Why did you hide your true capabilities for so long? I smiled, watching as Earth's first Titan-class vessel approached the gateway. Because sometimes the best way to teach a lesson isn't to show how strong you are. It's to show how wise you can be. The next few hours passed in a blur of diplomatic discussions and technological exchanges. The council chamber, once a place of judgment and skepticism, had transformed into a hub of collaboration. Species that had looked down on humanity's primitive technology were now eagerly studying our hybrid designs, particularly fascinated by how we managed to merge precursor principles with our own engineering. Sarah was in her element, explaining to a group of wide-eyed council scientists how we'd modified rail gun technology using precursor concepts. The trick wasn't to copy their technology, she explained, pulling up holographic diagrams, but to understand their principles and apply them in our own way. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most elegant. Meanwhile, I found myself in a quiet corner with the chief speaker, whose scales had settled into a contemplative blue-green hue. You know, they said, watching as the first joint expedition prepared to enter the gateway. We've encountered many species over the millennia. Some were warriors, others were scholars, but humanity, you're something entirely different. We're survivors, I replied, thinking of our long history on Earth. We've learned the hard way that strength alone isn't enough. You need wisdom to know when to use it, and more importantly, when not to. The precursor gateway pulsed with energy, its swirling patterns casting ethereal lights across the chamber. Through it, we could see glimpses of worlds beyond imagination, not just new planets or star systems, but entire realms of existence we'd never dreamed of. The precursors weren't just offering us technology, they were offering us a new understanding of the universe itself. We're establishing the first joint exploration team, Sarah announced, approaching us with her tablet. Representatives from every council species, working alongside human scientists and engineers. The precursors seem to approve. They're actually sharing more data than they did during our initial contact. The chief speaker's scales shifted to a color I'd never seen before, something between gold and silver. Perhaps that was their plan all along, not just to test each species individually, but to see if we could overcome our differences and work together. As if in response to those words, the precursor ships began to move, their ancient forms gracefully repositioning around the gateway. New patterns of energy flowed between them, and suddenly, the tactical display lit up with information. Maps of thousands of gateways spread throughout the galaxy and beyond, each leading to new discoveries, new challenges, and new opportunities for cooperation. Well, I said, unable to suppress a smile, I guess humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council didn't turn out quite like anyone expected. Sarah laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from her since this whole thing began. Who would have thought that our primitive weapons would end up being the key to the biggest diplomatic breakthrough in galactic history? The chief speaker made a sound that their translator rendered as a chuckle. Indeed, though I suspect we'll never hear the end of it from your species. Remember when you laughed at our guns? Will probably become a regular phrase in council meetings. Nah, I replied, watching as the first joint expedition team, humans and aliens working side by side, prepared to step through the gateway. We've got better things to focus on now. The universe just got a whole lot bigger, and we've got some exploring to do. As the expedition disappeared into the gateway, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come, from being dismissed as primitives to helping forge a new era of galactic cooperation, all because we'd stayed true to who we were while being willing to learn and adapt. The chief speaker touched my shoulder with one of their scaled appendages. Shall we join them? The precursors seem to think we're ready. I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Yeah, I said, I think we all are. And with that, humanity took its first step into a much larger universe, not as conquerors or primitives, but as equals, partners, and innovators. Sometimes the best way to prove yourself isn't to show how advanced you are, but to demonstrate how far you're willing to come together.